Okay, so ready to dive in. Today, we're going deep, real deep, into a YouTube transcript.
Sounds intriguing. What's the source material this time?
It's actually from a channel called Happy Learning. Catchy, right?
I like it,
So,
straight to the point.
yep.
So, what did they teach us how to be happy about learning?
Well, hold on to your hats because it's a recording of the very first workshop, the kickoff, of a Ramadan virtual pavilion. And get this, it was hosted by the Arab Open University Saudi Arabia branch in Jeddah back on March 1st.
Wow, March 1st. That feels like ages ago. Ramadan Virtual Pavilion, you say. What exactly is that?
Basically, it was this 3-week online event from March 1st all the way to March 20th, dedicated to learning and knowledge sharing all throughout Ramadan.
That's pretty impressive, especially during Ramadan. And they held these sessions online?
Yeah, all online. And not just any time, mind you. They were running from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. on Saturdays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. Imagine the commitment.
Wow, those are some dedicated learners. And I bet the topics were super interesting, judging by the name of the event.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just one narrow focus. They had sessions on Teal and Tell, teaching techniques, translation, how AI is being used for student learning. Then there was a whole discussion around a novel, an overview of their MA program. And that's not all. They even had a session on how to use AI for lesson planning. Oh, and they even delved into the history of the Saudi novel. Poetry readings, a look at the Sudanese cultural scene, you name it, they probably had it.
That's a pretty packed schedule. It sounds like they created a really vibrant learning community online. So tell me, where do we dive in with this particular transcript? What's the focus for today?
Well, the workshop we're focusing on today is titled Teal from Common Sense to Nuance, led by Dr. Sam Abdi-Jal, head honcho of the English department there.
Teal from common sense to nuance. That's quite a title. What's the gist of it? What are we trying to uncover today?
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to unpack the concepts of common sense and nuance. Specifically, what do they mean in the world of teaching? We'll also be looking at some of the starting assumptions about teaching English as a second language, ELT for short, and the key areas in this field that Dr. Sam talked about.
Sounds like a plan. Let's get into it. How did Dr. Sam kick off the workshop?
Right off the bat, he threw out this question to the audience. What pops into your head when you hear the phrase common sense?
That's a good one to get people thinking. I imagine everyone has a slightly different interpretation of what common sense really means. How did the audience respond?
Yeah, it's one of those things that you think everyone understands, but when you actually try to define it, it gets a bit tricky. A lot of the response is centered around knowledge that's available to pretty much everyone, right? Basic practical knowledge, the kind of stuff that most people just get without needing a whole explanation.
Sort of like the unspoken rules of life, the things that are just kind of obvious.
Exactly. One participant even put it simply as what everyone knows when it comes to teaching, which, kind of begs the question, what does everyone know about teaching?
Right, because what might be obvious to one person could be a complete mystery to someone else. So how did they clarify what common sense actually means in this context?
Well, they turn to the ultimate source of knowledge, Wikipedia.
Of course, the go-to for instant clarification. What gems did they unearth from the Wikipedia definition?
Well, there were a few key phrases that really stood out. Universal knowledge, that sense of shared understanding. Then there was the idea that it's held by everyone, or at least nearly all people, and the fact that it's picked up without reflection, without any need for debate or arguments. It's like and conventional wisdom popped up too. Those long-held beliefs have been passed down through generations.
So it's essentially knowledge that feels self-evident, widely accepted, almost like an unwritten rule book. But how do we apply this concept of common sense to the specific challenges of teaching, especially when it comes to teaching English as a second language?
That's where things get really interesting. And that's exactly what they explored next. What emerged from the discussion were all those teaching techniques and approaches that just feel intuitively right.
What were some of those common sense approaches to teaching English that resonated with the participants?
The first one that came up, and I think most teachers would agree, is using visuals, pictures, diagrams, anything that helps make the language more concrete. Makes sense, right?
Absolutely. Visual aids can be so powerful, especially when you're dealing with learners from diverse backgrounds and language levels. What else did they highlight?
Another big one was the importance of repetition. Drilling those key words and phrases, giving students multiple opportunities to hear and use the language.
Repetition can definitely help solidify learning, but I guess it's also about finding that balance, right? You don't want to bore the students to death with endless drills.
Oh, for sure. It's got to be engaging and meaningful repetition, not just mindless parroting. And that ties in with the next point, which is encouraging students to actually speak, getting them to use the language actively, not just passively absorbing it.
I think that's crucial. Creating a safe and supportive environment where students feel comfortable taking risks and practicing their speaking skills. It can be intimidating, especially when you're learning a new language.
Definitely. And if, along those lines, another common sense element was the teacher's own speech, making sure it's clear, at an appropriate pace, and using language that the students can understand.
So basically, no mumbling or speaking too quickly, and being mindful of the vocabulary and grammatical structures you use.
Yep. Got to keep it comprehensible. Another biggie, and this might seem obvious, but avoiding overly complex vocabulary and grammar when you're teaching beginners. Start with the basics and gradually build from there.
Makes sense. No need to overwhelm them with jargon or complicated sentence structures right from the get-go. Gradual progression is key.
Absolutely. And they also stress the importance of understanding what level your students are at. Their existing knowledge, their strengths and weaknesses. Can't just teach everyone the same way, right?
Right. Differentiating instruction, catering to individual needs. It's one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the most important aspects of effective teaching.
Totally. And lastly, the whole idea of considering the learner's needs. What are their goals? What are they struggling with? What motivates them?
It's all about putting the learners at the center of the teaching process, making sure the learning experience is relevant and meaningful for them. So they covered a lot of ground just with this initial discussion about common sense in ELT.
They really did.
Yeah.
But hold on tight, because Dr. Sam then took it up a notch. He had his own list, a pretty comprehensive one, of what he considers the essential common sense elements of teaching.
I'm all ears. What were some of the highlights from his list?
Well, first and foremost, he emphasized that the classroom should truly be about the students. Their learning, their engagement, their progress. It's not about the teacher showing off their knowledge or lecturing endlessly.
The student-centered learning, right. Shifting the focus from the teacher as the holder of all knowledge to the students as active participants in the learning process.
Yep, exactly that. And he stressed minimizing teacher talk time. Letting the students do most of the talking, creating those opportunities for them to practice and use the language.
That can be a tough one for some teachers, though, letting go of that control and letting the students lead the way.
For sure, it takes practice and a certain level of confidence. Okay, another key point on his list was being mindful of the language used when grading students' work. Providing constructive feedback that encourages growth rather than just focusing on errors.
That makes sense. It's about motivating students and fostering a positive learning environment. Nobody likes to be constantly criticized or made to feel like they're not good enough.
Absolutely. And then this one might seem super obvious, but he highlighted the importance of giving instructions that are crystal clear. Making sure the students actually understand what they're supposed to be doing.
That's more important than it might seem. Unclear instructions can lead to confusion, frustration, and wasted time. So being very explicit and checking for understanding is key.
Totally agree. Then there's the whole idea of monitoring students' progress, constantly keeping an eye on how they're doing, identifying any areas where they might be struggling, and providing support where needed.
Continuous assessment, essentially. Gathering information about student learning throughout the course, not just relying on end-of-term exams.
Exactly. And then this one might seem like a no-brainer, but he really emphasized the importance of actually using English in the English classroom as much as possible, creating that immersive language environment.
That makes sense, especially for learners who don't have a lot of exposure to English outside of the classroom. The more they hear and use the language, the better.
Right. And of course, no surprises here. But lesson planning was a big one on his list. Having clear objectives, structured activities, and a well-thought-out plan for each lesson.
That's the foundation of good teaching, isn't it? Having a roadmap for where you want to go and how you're going to get there with your students.
Definitely. He also touched upon the importance of grouping students strategically. Sometimes pairing them up, sometimes putting them in small groups, sometimes having them work individually, depending on the task and the learning objectives.
Collaborative learning, mixed ability groupings, it's all about using different group dynamics to maximize student interaction and learning.
Yep, exactly. And of course, building good relationships with your learners is crucial. Creating that rapport, that sense of trust and respect, making them feel comfortable and supported.
Absolutely. A positive classroom environment is so important for learning. Students are more likely to engage and participate when they feel connected to their teacher and their classmates.
Okay, a few more to go. He also emphasized the importance of making sure you're actually meeting the goals of the lesson. checking to see if the students have actually learned what you intended them to learn.
That's where assessment comes in, right? Using different methods to gauge student understanding and identify any areas that need revisiting.
Yep, spot on. Then there's providing feedback on students' work, giving them specific and actionable advice on how to improve their skills.
Feedback is so crucial for growth. It's how students know what they're doing well and where they need to focus their efforts.
And finally, and this kind of ties back to the point about relationships, he highlighted the importance of establishing a good rapport with your students, creating that positive and supportive learning environment where they feel comfortable taking risks and making mistakes.
So his list really covers a lot of ground. It's like the ultimate checklist for effective teaching, right?
It really is. But there's a twist. The workshop didn't just stop at common sense. They took it a step further, introducing this idea of nuance, or as they cleverly put it, nuance.
It's intriguing. What's the distinction between relying solely on common sense and embracing nuance in the context of teaching?
That's the million-dollar question. The way they explained it, nuance is something that requires a bit more conscious effort. It's about going deeper, developing a more sophisticated understanding that goes beyond what's immediately apparent or readily available.
So while common sense might be about knowing the basics, talking the talk, nuance is about putting that knowledge into practice with a deeper level of insight, walking the walk, so to speak.
Exactly. It's about moving from basic competence to a much more refined and insightful grasp of teaching principles, recognizing that there's always more to learn, more to understand.
It's that continuous journey of professional development, always seeking to improve your craft.
Now, to really drive home the importance of going beyond the surface level, the workshop introduced a really thought-provoking point. They brought up this familiar saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
I like that analogy. How did they connect that to the world of teaching?
They used it to illustrate the danger of becoming too reliant on just one teaching method or strategy. If a teacher only have one tool in their toolkit, they're going to be tempted to apply that same approach to every situation, whether it's the best fit or not.
So instead of considering the unique needs of each student or the specific context of a lesson, they just keep hammering away with the same old approach.
Exactly. And that can be a recipe for disaster. It completely ignores the importance of interaction, of being flexible and adaptable, of thinking creatively, and of recognizing that every learner is different.
A one-size-fits-all approach rarely works, especially in education. So what's the takeaway for teachers? How can they avoid falling into this hammer trap?
The workshop stressed the importance of self-awareness. Teachers need to be conscious of their own potential biases, their preferred methods, and be willing to step outside their comfort zones and try new things. It's about being open to different perspectives and approaches, recognizing that there's always more to learn and more effective ways to teach.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about being a reflective practitioner, constantly evaluating your own practice and seeking ways to improve.
And speaking of self-awareness, the workshop also touched upon a fascinating psychological concept known as the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Ah, the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's a good one. For those who might not be familiar with it, could you explain what it is?
In a nutshell, the Dunning-Kruger effect describes this cognitive bias, where people who are actually not very competent in a particular area tend to overestimate their own abilities. It's like they don't know enough to know how much they don't know.
Classic case of blissful ignorance, right? But how does this relate to teaching?
Well, imagine a teacher who genuinely believes they're doing a fantastic job, but they're completely oblivious to the gaps in their knowledge or the areas where they could improve. This lack of awareness can prevent them from seeking professional development or adopting new teaching strategies because they simply don't see the need.
Oh, I can see how that could be a problem. It's like being stuck in a rut without even realizing it.
Exactly. And to illustrate the different stages of competence we go through as learners, they introduced this model called the hierarchy of competence.
The hierarchy of competence. I remember learning about that in my teacher training. It's a really helpful framework for understanding the process of skill development. Can you remind us of the different stages?
Absolutely. So it starts with unconscious incompetence. This is the stage where you're completely clueless. You don't even realize that you don't know something. It's like being blissfully unaware of your own shortcomings.
We've all been there at some point in our lives. What's the next stage?
The next stage is conscious incompetence. This is where the light bulb starts to flicker. You begin to realize, oh, wait a minute, I actually don't know as much as I thought I did. You become aware of the gaps in your knowledge or skills.
It's that moment of realization when you realize you have a lot more to learn than you initially thought.
Yep. Then comes conscious competence. This is where you've actually started to acquire the knowledge or skill, but it still requires conscious effort and concentration. You might make mistakes, you might stumble a bit, but you're actively working towards mastery.
It's like learning to drive. At first, you have to think about every step, but eventually it becomes more automatic.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final stage, unconscious competence. This is the holy grail of skill development. It's where you can perform the skill effortlessly without even thinking about it. It becomes second nature, like riding a bike or tying your shoelaces.
It's that flow state where everything just clicks and you're operating at your peak performance.
And that's what we're all striving for, right? To reach that level of mastery in our chosen fields.
Absolutely. So, after exploring these models of competence and self-awareness, what did the workshop focus on next?
They dove headfirst into the murky waters of common assumptions about teaching. Those deeply ingrained beliefs that often go unquestioned.
Assumptions can be dangerous, especially in education. They can limit our thinking and prevent us from exploring new possibilities. Which assumption did they tackle first?
The first one on the chopping block was this. The learner's native language, their L1, should never be used in the classroom.
That's a pretty strong stance. What was the reasoning behind that belief?
The argument was that the target language, in this case English, should be the primary mode of communication in the classroom, to maximize exposure and create an immersive language environment.
So the idea is to immerse students in the target language as much as possible. But didn't they also discuss some potential benefits of strategically using the learner's L1?
Absolutely. They acknowledged that the L1 can be a valuable tool in certain situations. For example, when you're dealing with complex concepts that might be difficult to explain in English alone, or when you're comparing and contrasting grammatical structures between the L1 and English.
That makes sense. Sometimes using the learner's native language can actually enhance their understanding of the target language.
Exactly. They also brought up the practical considerations of teaching in multilingual classrooms versus more homogeneous settings. In a multilingual classroom, the teacher might not share the learner's L1, so using English is often the only option. But in a setting like Saudi Arabia, where most students share Arabic as their first language, there might be more opportunities to strategically incorporate the L1.
So the context plays a big role in determining how and when to use the L1. What was the final verdict on this issue?
The key takeaway seemed to be this idea of judicious use of the L1. It's about using it strategically as a support tool, not as a crutch. You're using it when it genuinely benefits student learning, but not letting it become the dominant language in the classroom.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Using the L1 to scaffold learning without undermining the goal of English language acquisition.
Precisely. Okay, ready for the next assumption that got debunked?
Hit me with it. What other sacred cow did they dare to challenge?
This one was a biggie. Good language learners usually have high IQs.
That's a dangerous assumption to make. I can see why they felt the need to address that one. Why did they say it was harmful?
The main concern was that this belief could lead to teachers having lower expectations for students who they perceive as having lower IQs. And unfortunately, those lowered expectations can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely. If a teacher doesn't believe that a student is capable of learning, they might not provide them with the same level of support or challenge, and that can ultimately hinder the student's progress.
Exactly. They emphasized that language learning is influenced by so many other factors besides IQ, such as motivation, exposure to the language, and the amount of effort the learner puts in.
That's so important to remember. Every student has the potential to learn, regardless of their perceived intelligence. It's about creating a supportive environment where everyone feels empowered to succeed.
Now, the next assumption they tackled was this. Learners' errors should be corrected as soon as they are made to prevent bad habits from forming.
That's a common belief, especially among new teachers. They're so eager to correct every little mistake. But what's the argument against this immediate correction approach?
Well, the main point they made was that constant correction can actually be detrimental to learners, especially in the early stages. It can make them hesitant to speak, lower their confidence, and ultimately hinder their fluency development.
It's like constantly interrupting someone when they're trying to tell a story. It disrupts the flow and makes it harder for them to express themselves.
Exactly. And they even drew a parallel to how children learn their first language. We don't constantly nitpick every grammatical error a child makes. Instead, we encourage them to communicate, we focus on the meaning they're trying to convey, and they gradually refine their language skills over time.
It's about fostering a love of language and a willingness to experiment, not creating a fear of making mistakes.
Right. And they mention this technique called recasting, which is a more subtle and less intrusive way to correct errors. Instead of directly pointing out the mistake, the teacher simply rephrases the student's utterance correctly, providing a model without interrupting the flow of conversation.
That's a much more supportive approach. It allows students to hear the correct form without feeling like they're constantly being judged or corrected.
Now, the next assumption they discussed was pretty straightforward. Good language lessons should have very clearly defined learning objectives.
That one seems pretty self-explanatory. What was the general consensus on that?
This was seen as a fundamental principle of good teaching, a no-brainer, really. Clear learning objectives provide a sense of purpose and direction for both the teacher and the students. Everyone knows what they're working towards.
Absolutely. Without clear objectives, a lesson can easily become a meandering mess. So it's essential to establish those learning goals up front.
And the final assumption they tackled was this. Most mistakes that foreign language learners make are due to interference from their mother tongue.
Ah, the classic L1 interference theory. But they challenged that assumption, right?
They did indeed. They pointed out that while L1 interference certainly plays a role, it's not the only source of errors. Errors can also stem from a learner's incomplete knowledge of the target language, gaps in their understanding of grammar or vocabulary. They can also be a natural part of the language learning process as learners develop their own internal grammar, what's called interlanguage.
Interlanguage, that's a fancy term. What does it mean?
It basically refers to the stages learners go through as they develop their understanding of the target language. They might create their own rules or patterns that don't quite align with the standard grammar, but it's all part of the journey towards mastery.
So it's like a stepping stone, a bridge between the learner's L1 and the target language.
Yep, exactly that. And they even pointed out that sometimes teachers themselves can unintentionally introduce errors.
Teacher-induced errors, how does that happen?
Well, they shared this anecdote about a young learner who consistently mispronounced the word mosque, saying mosque instead. And it turned out that it was because the teacher had been mispronouncing it that way all along.
Oh, wow. That's a great example of how teachers can have a powerful influence on their students' language development, even in subtle ways.
Definitely. And it highlights the importance of teachers being mindful of their own language use and pronunciation, especially when working with young learners who are like sponges, soaking up everything they hear.
It's a good reminder that we're all lifelong learners, and even teachers make mistakes. It's how we learn and grow from those mistakes that matters.
Okay, ready to shift gears a bit. In the final part of the workshop, Dr. Sam gave a broad overview of the key areas that make up the field of ELT.
So he zoomed out from specific teaching techniques and assumptions to the bigger picture of English language teaching as a whole. What were the main components he outlined?
He covered a lot of ground. He started with the most fundamental element of all, language itself. What is language? What makes it so unique and powerful? Why is English such a dominant language in the world today?
Those are big questions. How did he approach them?
He discussed the different processes involved in language acquisition, drawing distinctions between how we learn our first language and how we learn a second or additional language. He also talked about the different contexts in which English is taught and learned around the world.
Like EFL, ESL, and all those acronyms that can be confusing for people outside the field. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. EFL stands for English as a Foreign Language. This is typically how English is taught in countries where English isn't the official language, so students are learning it as a foreign language. ESL, on the other hand, stands for English as a Second Language, which usually refers to teaching English to learners who are living in an English-speaking country and need to learn the language to function in their daily lives.
Okay, I see the difference. So EFL is more about learning English for academic or professional purposes, while ESL is more focused on practical communication skills for everyday life. What are the other acronyms?
There's also EAL, which stands for English as an Additional Language. This term acknowledges that many learners already speak more than one language, so English is an additional language to their existing repertoire. And then there's ELF, which stands for English as a Lingua Franca.
ELF, what's that all about?
ELF refers to the use of English as a common language of communication between speakers of different first languages. In situations where English isn't anyone's native language, but is being used as a shared language for communication.
So it's like English as a global language, transcending national boundaries and cultural differences. Interesting. What else did Dr. Sam cover in his overview of key ELT areas?
He then moved on to the 4 core language skills: listening, reading, speaking, and writing. He emphasized that teaching these skills effectively involves breaking them down into specific sub-skills and equipping learners with effective learning strategies.
So it's not just about teaching students to speak, but about teaching them specific speaking sub-skills like pronunciation, fluency, grammar, and vocabulary. And the same goes for the other skills.
Exactly. And he also highlighted the important distinction between productive skills and receptive skills.
Refresh my memory. What's the difference between those?
Productive skills are the ones where the learner is producing language, so that would be speaking and writing. Receptive skills, on the other hand, are the ones where the learner is receiving and understanding language, so that would be listening and reading.
Right. Makes sense. So after language skills, what was the next area on Dr. Sam's ELT roadmap?
The final area he covered was language systems. These are the underlying building blocks of language itself.
The nuts and bolts, so to speak. What falls under that category?
He included grammar, which is the system of rules that govern how words are combined to form sentences. Then there's vocabulary, also known as lexis, which refers to all the words in a language. And then there's pronunciation, or phonology, which deals with the sounds of language and how they're produced and perceived. And finally, he included discourse, which is how language is used in connected speech and writing to create meaning.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive overview of the key areas in ELT. Did he go into detail about each of those areas?
He definitely touched upon them, but he made it clear that they would be explored in much greater depth in the subsequent sessions of the Ramadan Virtual Pavilion Forum. So stay tuned, because I have a feeling we'll be diving into some of those areas in future episodes.
I'm already looking forward to it. This deep dive has been a fascinating journey, taking us from the seemingly simple concept of common sense to the intricate world of English language teaching.
We've explored why it's so crucial to constantly question our assumptions. We've looked at the different stages of competence we go through as learners, and we've gained a valuable glimpse into the diverse and ever-evolving field of ELT.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. Thinking about the hierarchy of competence and our discussion about all those common sense assumptions, is there perhaps an area in your own learning journey, whether it's personal or professional, where you might be operating under unconscious incompetence, not even realizing what you don't know? Or perhaps an area where you're relying a bit too heavily on that one familiar hammer when a whole toolbox of options might be available?
That's a great question to ponder. And if you find yourself in that situation, what might be one new tool or perspective that could really help you level up your skills and knowledge?
Remember, learning is a lifelong journey, and there's always room for growth and improvement.
And it's never too late to challenge those ingrained assumptions and explore new ways of thinking and doing.
On that note, I think it's time to surface from our deep dive.
Thanks for joining us on this enlightening exploration of common sense, nuance, and the multifaceted world of ELT. Until our next deep dive, keep those minds open and keep learning.